Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast, Minimizing Cyber Risk for Operational Technology, Principles for Readiness using IEC 62443, sponsored by Fortinet and Notorio. My name is Carol, author of SANS, and I will be moderating today's webcast. Today's featured speakers are Jean-Francois J. Gignac, OT, ICS, IoT, SME, and VP Global Sales at Notorio, Joe Robertson, EMEA Field CISO at Fortinet, and Jeffrey Shearer, author and instructor at the SANS Institute. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenters, please enter them into the Q&A window at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to our presenters.
Hello, and welcome to the SANS Institute Industrial Control System Security webcast. My name is Jeff Shearer. I am a SANS Institute instructor and a co-author of the ICS 612 Cybersecurity In-Depth course. I'm a 37-year veteran, it's hard to say that, of architecting, implementing, and securing ICS systems. Today's topic, minimizing cyber risk for operational technology, or OT, we'll look at the principles of readiness using the IEC 62443 standard. Specifically, I wanted to share with you how I used that standard when I was in Rockwell Automation, both with the product development teams and with my clients who were putting systems together to understand IEC 62443. We're also blessed to have a panel of guests to discuss their experiences with IEC 62443 as well. So with that, let's look at the agenda. So the first thing I want to do is introduce or have our two gentlemen speakers introduce themselves. And then I'll move on to summarizing IEC 62443, how I used it. That is such a rich standard, and it would take a month of Sundays to be able to go through the entire spec and all the documents. So I'm just going to review and summarize the things that I pulled out and how I use them, not daily, but quite often. Then we're going to kick it over to our panel, and we're going to walk through their relevant experiences with 62443. And generally speaking, how do we do risk assessments and how do we kind of look at it against that 62443 backdrop? And then we're going to be fielding your questions. So we want to make sure that this is an interactive session. It will not be death by PowerPoints, I promise you that. So with that said, I introduce myself. I would like Jay to go ahead and introduce himself, and then we'll kick it over to Joe so that he can talk about himself and his experiences. Jay.
Thank you, Jeff. Jay Gignac. So as mentioned, I've been in the industrial space for almost 7 years now, 8 years. Worked with vendors like SourceFire and Cisco back in the day. And that's where I got introduced to industrial cybersecurity. And since then, I've worked with a number of startups in the industry. Having been in cybersecurity space for going on 20 years now, there's a number of revolutions that I've had the pleasure to experience as transitions for organizations out there, from the spam era to the next-gen firewall revolution to adoption of virtualization in cybersecurity and the applications, as well as cloud adoption. And certainly one of the topics that has come back over the years is this digital transformation and converged environments and how they impact the posture, the security, the risk of operational environments. So very happy to be here, and thank you to Jeff and Carol for setting this up. Looking forward to the discussion.
Very glad to have you. Joe.
Well, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure for me to be here too. I have been in the technology business for over 40 years now. Most of that in the networking and the security areas of companies like IBM, Nortel Networks, Juniper Networks, and now at Fortinet, where my focus is largely on operational technology and protecting assets and protecting the production and the manufacturing and the operations areas, because these are areas that have become very, very attractive to attackers in the last few years, and they do not unfortunately have the same level of protection that IT has built up. They're being attacked by the same types of attackers that IT has been facing for the last 30 years or more, but we don't have 30 years of experience in defending ourselves in operations. And so that's part of the real enjoyable part of my role, is to be able to work with people and protect these very, very valuable resources.
Thanks. Thank you, Joe. And again, thanks to both of you for being here. So next on our agenda, I really wanted to walk through what is IEC 62443. Just give a brief review and summarize kind of my experiences with it and pull out maybe a few nuggets. This is a very iconic image of what is involved with the 62443 standards. And you can see that it is a series of documents. It isn't just one great big thick book. It is actually broken into many different categories, everything from the top level, which is the general row, all the way down to the bottom, which are components. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time grounding us on the general row. So I'm going to talk about 62443 1-1, which is going to be on the left-hand corner there. And then I'm going to jump down to the systems, 3-3-2 and 3-3-3. And I have a purpose for this. Here is another iconic kind of picture that says that these series of standards are still being developed. If you look at the key in the bottom, there are some that were planned and are done. There are some that are still being worked on. So key takeaways here is these are really living documents, and you can actually get involved to help shape these standards. I didn't mention this before, but I'll mention it now, is when I was at Rockwell and we looked, when I was looking through these standards, and I had to deal with our own product development groups to understand these standards, as well as working with clients that were putting these systems together. I had the opportunity to work with some really great people who dove really deeply into these, like Alex Nickel, who you'll hear on different recordings, is part of ISA and still working on these documents. And so what I'm kind of transcribing were things that I learned, but also things that other people richly shared with me. So just be aware that these standards are actually still being worked on. So let's look at how I approach those standards. The first thing you need to understand is the 1-1 standard. And the 1-1 standard really grounds us on terms, definitions, abbreviations. And it comes up with standard vernacular like foundational requirements, FRs. It has us look at threat and risk assessments. It talks about how do we break our plant floor or our production floors into security zones, and then how do we map the conduits or the communication paths between those two security zones. And then lastly, it talks us through security levels. What is a security level? Like, what does that even mean? And so it walks us through there. Now we're going to skip down into the system models. And if you look at 3-2, it talks specifically about risk assessment and system design. So there's a lot to be gleaned out of 3-2, which includes how do you do risk assessments? How do you partition the system under consideration into these security zones and conduits? And how do you perform risk assessments? How do you document their constraints? For instance, you might have a PLC that isn't a firewall. Maybe it can't do different kinds of technical controls. So what are the constraints of a device, or whatever constraints of a system? And what other technical controls might you actually need in order to create or gain a certain security level? It has a nice Annex B, or an informative Part B, that walks you through a typical 3x5 security matrix, where the likelihood of the event you can map from 1 to 5, and then the severity or the impact that would happen if you actually saw that actual impact occur. So it gives you some really good examples, and I enjoyed reading through that standard. These are the different areas of focuses, and it walks you through different kinds of requirements, requirement enhancements, and security levels. And please note that I went from the document 3-2 to 3-3, and this is actually my favorite. And if we were to look at the top left where it said 5.3, human user identification and authentication, it has this consistency in this particular 3-3 standard that walks through what are the requirements, what are the requirement enhancements to achieve the security levels that we see on the right-hand side. So SL1, SL2, SL3, SL4. And so it walks you through the areas of focus with the kind of the backdrop of how do I achieve these different security levels. I put this slide together to just show you the multiple areas of focus and the deepness and richness of this standard. It talks of everything about like strength of passwords all the way through wireless, through mobile code and timestamps. So it gives you a checklist of the things that you should be thinking about while you're rolling out your standard or as you're implementing your standard. And then it kind of crescendos in this Annex B. I really like this Annex B. If you were to look at the left-hand side and look down at table B-1, there's a system level requirements and requirement enhancements table, and it's shown in red there. So if I were to try to achieve security level 1, 2, 3, or 4, I would look at, for instance, FR1, security requirements 1, system requirement 1, and I'd look at 1.1, 1.1 with requirement enhancement 1, requirement enhancement 2, requirement enhancement 3. I would see that if I just did human user identification, like a control system could identify the human that's interacting with it, I would achieve security level 1. If I wanted to move to security level 2, I would have to have a unique identification and authentication. If I wanted to move to security level 3, I would have to do multi-factor authentication for untrusted networks. And then security level 4, I would have to do multi-factor authentication for all the networks. So these tables tell you all of the areas of interest that you have to focus on, and then what security level you want to achieve. It depends on your requirements, and then how you achieve those. And so this standard does a great job of being very detailed of how you would do that. So if you're going to apply these to a system, we can think of individualized components brought together in a systematic way to achieve a goal. So for instance, it's a grouping of PLCs, of HMIs, historians, workstations, etc., that we would call our system. And we would use that method that I just described to look at the security level that we're trying to achieve. And there's basically about 7 foundational requirements that we would have to consider if we wanted to look at securing an entire industrial control system. You can see them there, FR1 through FR7. And so what you do is you can apply those foundational requirements to a simple component all the way out through a system. And here's how I did it. I would take those foundational requirements and I would look at the security levels across the top that I wanted to achieve. And then I would look in 62443 and I would look at those methods to actually achieve the different requirements that I wanted to achieve. So for instance, I looked at the left-hand side and I said security requirement 1.1, human user identification and authentication, and I go over to the column that says methods to achieve. It lists out there the different methods to achieve identification and authentication. And I would list the technology that I use to accomplish those security levels. And then I would look at the vendor products that are using these technologies and kind of mapping this across. Now I could get a good picture of the security level that I'm currently at, or I could look and make a goal of how I wanted to achieve the different security levels. And that's kind of 62443 boiled down from my point of view. I know this standard is very deep and there are many ways to do this. This is how I did it, and this is how I use 62443 to achieve either clients or internal goals for myself. With that said, I really want to engage our panel, since we've kind of level set what is 62443 and walks you through some of their relevant experiences, not just mine. So I'm going to ask Joe and Jay to go ahead and jump in. And I just have some seed questions here so that we can all discuss kind of a common topic. So The first question is, why do we need a different cybersecurity perspective when it comes to OT versus IT? In other words, why did we need to create something like IEC 62443? And Joe, I'll start with you. What's kind of your opinion on this?
Well, I think it's because of the very fundamental differences between OT and IT, and that IT deals with immaterial bits, and it means if you have a problem with it, you may have a problem being able to perform actions with the enterprise management system. You have data, personal data that you're protecting. There's all kinds of insubstantial bits, but when it comes to OT, we're talking about physical systems, and physical systems can go wrong. Physical systems can cause harm to the environment, cause harm to people, illness, even death, depending on what's the type of environment we're talking about. And so we have to look at these fundamentally differently, because the danger that is posed by doing something wrong or having someone do something malicious is far greater, in the sense that it's a danger to human beings, life, safety, and actually the environment as well. Not to mention the number or the cost of the devices that are involved. And so if a device is actually substantially harmed by some kind of an attack, that is a large amount of money. That's a capital outlay that has to be replaced. So that's IE 62443 is really all about taking the physical environment that is a production environment and applying the appropriate levels of security and cyber safety to that physical environment, because it's so totally different from IT. Jay, do you have points you want to add to that, perhaps?
You took all the good points, Joe. So
that's why it's worth taking the first trick on it.
All right, I'm going to try to dig up a couple more. So I think that you're right on. So the dynamics that you've mentioned are certainly at play, and we're talking about. You made some great comments around impact. Impact to an operational environment can be much more consequential than, say, email going down or servers not being accessible or having outages within cloud instances and so on, which are all meaningful from an IT perspective. However, if you have loss of life or you have disruption, the financial impact to that can be considerable, not only in terms of loss of product, but supply chain events, as well as the financial heart of the company that's no longer functioning, because typically critical manufacturing, energy production, everything that makes our society run depends on operational technology. So I don't think that the stakes can be much higher. And if you look at the way that these environments have evolved over time, there's no standardization. There's a great diversity of protocols. There's a great diversity of vendors, of generations of product that share that space. You can have a device that is 25 years old sitting next to a device that is current generation right off the production floor from one of those vendors. How do you secure those? How do you understand the dynamics that would impact the vulnerabilities? But most, which is one of the things that I love about IEC, is the consideration of risk and walking away from making a statement around, well, this asset is vulnerable, without digging deeper and understanding its context. Why is it vulnerable? Is it impactful? Can it be exploited? Where does it live? Who does it communicate with? What part of process is it? And so on and so on. So I think that we have to recognize that not only are the impacts different between IT and OT, but also the assets that we own, their nature, their evolution, the types of firmware they use, the type of solutions that they run around, how they're managed, who they interact with, and so on. So I think there's a considerable amount of time and effort that needs to be spent properly assessing these systems and considering them to be part of a cybersecurity program. Not only from a general IT sense or enterprise sense, but really understanding the fundamentals, as you've mentioned, Jeff, around properly understanding why IEC was set up, how it evolved. It's not a new standard, it's been around for 20 years. So it's adapted over time and it reflects our current state. So it's a great place to start.
Absolutely. And I really like that you brought in the physical element. So there's an old joke about like nobody gets promoted or fired for writing a bad email, right? It's or writing good emails. But when we have a bad day in OT, there's a physical component to it. And sometimes it's like Peter Drucker talks about in his business books, is that businesses are in business to make a product at a profit, right? And so by securing our devices, we're actually and systems, we're actually trying to enhance profitability. And sometimes it's viewed as in getting in the way of productivity, when in fact it is actually an enabler for uptime, right? And it's not often viewed that way. And I would go so far as to say is that if the IT specs covered the bases, I don't think there would have been a 62443, but the general nature of OT devices and the physical nature and the quirkiness of them, they need to be protected in a different way. So
I think, Jay, you bring up a really good point there, because when it comes to protecting IT, for most companies, you're protecting some of their intellectual property, some of the aspects, the back office aspects, but protecting OT is protecting what the company does. Okay, mm-hmm. The company is all about producing this stuff, and that's what protecting OT is all about.
Yes, yeah, I really like that. Next kind of topic is we sometimes hear OT risk and OT vulnerability are not the same. Can we talk about the differences? And Jay, I'll put this one to you first. What's the difference between OT risk and OT vulnerability? Why are they not the same thing?
Right. So great question, and one which comes up all the time. So I think that we need to level set an understanding. You know, risk is a factor of impact and frequency. Typically, this is when you boil it down, and IEC does a great job of trying to identify how meaningful would the risk be. So a couple of things need to go into that thinking. So you understand that the role of an asset might be more impactful to its risk rather than the vulnerabilities that are associated to it. Mm-hmm. And certainly both will contribute to identifying the risk itself. But I think that we have to take a step back and try to look for a moment at what the industry has been kind of doing for the past decade or so, which has been really focused on identifying things, which is a great place to start, but it's not the end of the journey, right? So we need to understand what we have. We need to understand the vulnerabilities that are associated to it, but then we need to take a step further and understand the relationships as well as the role of these devices and potentially what they belong to within the organization. So one of the great things that I like about IEC are the security levels and the concepts around zones and conduits. Mm-hmm. Associating assets together upon a logical assumption that they're part of the same process, and how impactful is that process to the organization? How do you properly protect it? Because it represents a large proportion of the financial risk. It could have a large proportion of safety risk. It could have a large proportion of operational impact on the rest of the other cells, and so on and so on. And if you apply this to the fact that we have many of the environments that we work with that have grown over time through mergers and acquisitions or fusions of different organizations, which further enhances the diversity of vendors, support ecosystems, maintenance providers, you quickly understand that there are many components in the ecosystem that are impacting each of these assets potentially. So it is crucially important that we separate what a vulnerability is, which is something inherently that is part of the asset. Either it's a vulnerability in its software, its operating system, the hardware it runs on, some of the embedded services or embedded products that live in there that might not even be easy to understand that are present as part of that stack, and that each of these can proportionally bring their own set of vulnerabilities into the mix. It's not a simple task, and certainly it becomes difficult to differentiate which vulnerabilities are still at play, are still present. Should I patch? Should I not patch? Can I patch? And managing that type of dynamic around each of the vulnerabilities that exist gets greatly prioritized, and you get a great amount of context by understanding, well, for each of these vulnerabilities, I need to properly understand the risk that surrounds it and how impactful some of the mitigations, architecture decisions, segmentation, process mapping, and all these things that I've already done could be in play in helping me protect this environment, or at the very minimum, lay out for myself what my next steps should be in terms of addressing these risks and impacts.
Right. Joe, any additional comments?
Yeah, I liked what Jay was saying about vulnerabilities being inherent in the device, in the object, in the asset itself, because that's very true, and that's something that may or may not go away. The vulnerability may be corrected by the vendor of the control system or something like that, but that's not the same thing as the risk, because the risk is all about how that vulnerability is actually going to be used by a bad actor. And if you put enough defenses around that vulnerable asset, the risk is very low. Mm-hmm. And what the 62443 standard is about is trying to help you evaluate what it is that you have put in place to counteract the risk, to reduce the risk and counteract the vulnerability in those assets. And it lets you measure to a certain extent, it lets you measure that I have set up, as you were saying earlier, Jeffrey, that, for example, I've got different layers of authentication. Okay, if I've got just regular password, that's one level of risk that I've improved on. I can improve one more with two-factor authentication, even more with multi-factor authentication across the entire network. And that's the way that we need to be thinking about protecting our OT. We assume it's vulnerable. Now, what can we do to mitigate those vulnerabilities and reduce the risk?
Yeah, I really like where this is going, because there is a thread here about the criticality of something. And so when you go into real world situations and you say, yes, I understand this is at risk, but my risk is so small, I choose to not do anything about it. And there are some systems and some industries when that's not acceptable, but there's also industries that say, I'm okay with this risk. I will reduce it in my 5-year plan, in my 2-year plan, or some people or some companies, when you get a 90-day plan, what am I going to do like right now? They take those big criticalities and biggest risks and they try and address those, and they keep whittling it down and whittling it down. And so I really kind of like the way that we separated. There can be vulnerabilities, but the risk may indeed be very small. So next topic is I believe it was Jay who said, right now we need to progress to just get situational awareness, but that's not the end of our journey, which 100% agree with. But the question is, how can we gain situational awareness within the industrial control system environment? Can we just use the tools that we have if we're leveraging them from IT? Is there a difference? What should we be aware of, Joe?
Well, there are a lot of the same tools are going to be used, but we're going to have to use them differently. And we're going to have to go into depths that in IT we wouldn't expect to have to. Certainly, I think one of the things that Jay brought up earlier is that there are so many different vendors in this environment, so many different suppliers from not just the last few years, but the last decades. We're talking about equipment that in some cases is 30, 40, even 50 years old I've run into. And because of that, a traditional IT tool will look at it and say, I don't know what this is. I've never seen it before. And so situational awareness is still going to be about looking at what's on the network. It's going to be sniffing that network and seeing, okay, what are all of the devices that are attached? But you can't just assume it's IP. It's not going to be internet protocol necessarily. There are over 50 industrial protocols that you have to be able to understand to be able to detect who's on the network. And in fact, when I've worked with customers and they've put in place some kind of a probe to see what's on the network, they're usually astonished to find so many devices that they had no idea were connected. And so IT tools are good, but you need to go into more depth. You need to be able to go and look at, what is the device, who's the manufacturer, what's the microcode, that sort of thing. And that requires a huge amount of investment in time and understanding on the part of the vendors that can provide that. And not everyone can do it, that's for sure.
Absolutely. Jay, I'm sure you have a comment about this.
Am I so predictable, Jeff?
You are, since I met you, yes.
So I think that's a compliment.
It is a compliment, very much so, yeah.
So Joe made a great point, right? So he made it earlier, and I think he expanded upon it here. So we often hear that enterprise will make investment in IT security, and they'll invest considerably in the number of different devices or solutions, including services and outside parties that are going to monitor their environment. Now, the challenge is that many of these entities externally that specialize in IT security do not have a good understanding of the OT environment, and therefore the application of the tools is a risk. The use of standard IT tools to secure OT is a risk because there is a greater degree of what should I use, in what way, towards what target, and is it safe for me to do so? Because the primary premise and imperative within the operational environment is reliability, productivity, and safety, right? You want to make sure that those things are always respected. And IT tools traditionally may or may not have the skill behind them or the capabilities required to interact with the OT environment in a safe manner. So I think that there are some overlaps. Certainly we'll see some firewalls and switches that have enforcement capabilities or access list capabilities or those kind of things. And you want to have secure gateways in place. It helps with segmentation. You want to have thinking behind as to, what are my zones and what's allowed to communicate with what, and grouping your assets and understanding and so on as we go through the standards in IEC. But I think that I would take a sidestep here and say that if you've invested massively in IT security, you need to come to grasp with the fact that you need to understand what you can use. And certainly many of the investments that you've made in protecting your organizations can be leveraged and used. And the challenge is continuing this investment in order to properly address OT with tools that will collaborate with IT and bring this contextual or situational awareness about the OT environment into scope by understanding both sides of the house. We know that IT gets leveraged all the time to access OT, and there's a number of reasons here: cultural gaps between IT and OT, growth of these environments over time, permissions being granted, access being maintained when it is no longer relevant, and the controls around that are important to ensure that we're not allowing damaging interaction between IT and OT to continue evolving. So I'm diving into other things here, but I think that this is it's a crucial question. We need to understand that there are purpose-built tools that exist. They need to not only take OT into consideration, but interact as well with IT and the things that are already in place in order to provide meaningful investment and protection to both sides of the house.
Right.
I think that's a really important point there, Jay, because when you look at that OT environment, you can't just use a standard IT tool to do everything. But a company, a vendor that has a purview over both the IT and the OT environment that is involved in both sides is able to give a more holistic view. And where that becomes important is when you set up a network operating center and a security operations center. And there's always the big question: do you combine the IT SOC, the security operations center, with the OT SOC, or do you keep them separate? Because it does take very different levels of knowledge and skill. And I think it's important to keep in mind that we want to have the devices that are protecting both sides able to talk to each other in what some people call a mesh architecture, so that they can be passing information, threat information to each other. And And that really means that you need to take a hard look at what tools you use to protect your OT. It won't necessarily be the same ones that you've got in IT.
Yes. And I would throw out the point too is situational awareness from where, in quotes. So what I have found challenging is when, you know, factories and plants are made of different vendors' equipment. We kind of talked about that. Different vendors pick different automation suppliers, and they have situational awareness of their own, let's say, products in most cases. And they don't have a view beyond systems that they supply. And sometimes OEMs, or original equipment manufacturers, don't really care what the world looks like as long as their machine, widget, process, whatever, doesn't get interrupted. And so as an end user, you start to move the lens of what you care about out. And you say, I want situational awareness from supply chain. I want situational awareness from my own IT staff and my own support systems, quality systems, whatever. And I want situational awareness all the way down to, let's say, skid level at sometimes. So situational awareness, a lot of times, I heard many years ago, the challenges for situational awareness will be to put it underneath one glass and be able to see all of the systems that we have. And I'm like, that is a brilliant statement, because we're still fighting with that many years later. So
and you, if I could just add something to what you just said, Jeff. So you brought up something which I think we've left to the side in this conversation. And you know, the three pillars are always people, process, technology. So you know, the question is a little loaded towards the tools, but the tools are only meaningful if you have the right knowledge to use them, as well as the right situational milestones that you're aware that you need to compare yourself against. So I think this is a place where IEC truly is more prescriptive in the way to do things and measure things versus, say, perhaps potentially NIST, which is more governance based. I find that there's a lot of things around here that we also need to review where the organization is in terms of maturity and capabilities, because that is going to also impact not only the available tools, but how to use them. And if you need to outsource certain components in terms of your program planning for securing your environments.
Yes.
I think another big challenge in properly leveraging tools in these environments is we've traditionally taken an approach to saying, well, here are my tools in the toolbox. I can sniff the wire, I can ping things as carefully as possible, not to bring anything down. And we've really lacked the ability to share context. You've mentioned that there are a number of vendors that have situational awareness around their own solutions. Mm-hmm. How can you tap into that? How can you export that situational awareness and bring it back to a fabric that collaborates and shares this information? We didn't have those tools available a few years ago. They're here now, right? So having the ability to have that skill gap addressed, but that informational gap, as well as understanding, well, what tools are available to me? And how can I challenge the assumptions that what I'm going to get from the market is just detection and visibility? I have to be able to graduate a little further down the road. And one of the things that's great about OT security actually is that we've skipped some steps from the IT side. The IT investment side has gone through a number of different phases over time over the last 20 years. And there's been a lot of point solutions that have come and gone, and they've gotten amalgamated or fused into platforms. And so we've kind of jumped a few steps forward on the OT security side and sidestep a couple of these slower milestones to go to learning from our experiences from IT, collaboration, the ability to ingest information from multiple sources and so on, and apply it intelligently, both from a compliance perspective, but also from a security perspective.
Absolutely.
I'll climb down from my soapbox now.
No. That's absolutely, I believe that's going to be a challenge with OT in general. And basically this bullet point is to say, don't just think that there's one pane of glass that brings all the information. That is our challenge. And to be situationally aware from where in the environment that you're trying to get information from is a big challenge. And it is one that is still, in my opinion, not tackled. So I get asked this question a lot, and I'm putting this against the 62443 standards of why we're trying to harden OT systems and understand the connection between IT and OT. But I get asked this question quite a bit. If IT systems are compromised, why does it compromise OT operations, or vice versa? Why did OT systems affect IT systems? So one of you.
Sure.
Yep.
Well, I'll jump in because one of the things that is still true is the majority of compromised OT environments, the malware or the attack actually filtered in from the IT side. That attackers are much better at getting into IT because they've been focusing on it for so long, and they're starting to see that operational technology is interesting. But if an IT system is compromised, one good example actually of where IT compromise broke down the operations is the Colonial Pipeline problems of last year, where they had to shut down the pipeline in the United States for 5 days, 6 days, something like that. Not because they couldn't actually push the fuels through the pipelines, but because they didn't have the management systems. The IT systems had been attacked, and they were the ones that were unable to track who was getting billed for what was going where, all of those sorts of things. So if you break down the someplace in the supply chain on the IT side, that's going to gum up the works for OT, even if it doesn't harm any of the material and the assets at all.
Yes, Jay.
There's a lot of ink that's been spilled over answering this question. So again, Joe is nailing the point. I think that behind that point is an understanding that, so whether you're facing, mistakes, which happen all the time, and if you map those to the security levels, you'll remember that it's, internal employees, mistakes, misuse of systems. That could be security level 1. Security level 2 would be the unpersistent hacker, the hacker that is more or less motivated to compromise the system. Maybe it's automated tools and so on. And then you have the more dedicated attacker at security level 3, and eventually the nation state at security level 4. So I think there's a good understanding that you need to understand your risk profile and your threat profile, and that's going to inform both your investment, your planning, as well as how you assess yourself to understand really what is your true posture, as well as your true source of truth as to what you have, what vulnerabilities are there, what risks are implied, what risks are explicit, what you need to correct, and so on and so on. So it's no secret that often IT and OT evolves as siloed organizations within many industrial companies, and they don't talk enough, they don't exchange enough, they don't collaborate enough. And this is not a judgment of these organizations themselves. It's a factual analysis of where our market is currently, and how many of the attacks that we're seeing in the field are actually leveraging this cultural gap, which leads to policy gaps, that leads to configuration gaps, to cyber hygiene that is just not present. Many of the organizations that we collaborate with don't have a good understanding of what latent accesses exist within their environment. They don't have a good understanding of how their firewalls are configured, or how their segmentation impacts negatively their environment, or that the flat architecture that they have is actually a risk in itself and it creates single point of failures, and so on and so on. So I think that if you're going to understand how to secure your OT operations, you need to understand how IT has contributed or how your culture has contributed to creating gaps in your environment, which will be exploited, because humans by nature are lazy at times, and cyber criminals are certainly no different, and they're always looking for the low-hanging fruit. And unfortunately, we're kind of making it easy. There's a number of exposed assets out there that you can find with not too much effort, and it's a question of how OT environments have survived for an extended period of time by what we call security by obscurity. The fact that it was OT, there's a false sense of security that, I'm not going to be impacted because hackers out there, or cyber criminals, or anybody who persistently wants to get in does not understand OT protocols, therefore I'm not at risk. Well, Unfortunately, that is not true. And what we're seeing is a propagation of these events. Anybody that wants to, go out on Google and research the last 18 months will see that the cadence and severity of these activities for those that are reported has only been growing considerably over time. And we see this as a shift as well when we speak to CISOs within OT environments, that they're finally getting more budget to address these problems because there's a recognition that OT needs to be secured.
Yeah.
It is no longer a subset of IT. It is no longer isolated from IT. Convergence has happened. It continues to happen. And the gains in productivity also come with a gain of exposure. There's a very direct correlation there.
Yes, the only thing I'll add to that is the why is IT systems a lot of times are kind of the conductor, and the OT systems are kind of the band or the orchestra. And a lot of times the OT system can store and then forward information, but they're waiting on IT or the conductor to give let's play this song, let's do this, here's what we're going to make. And those higher level system actually orchestrates the OT operations. And once they are compromised, the OT operations can make whatever products they are capable of until the conductor comes back online and says, okay, make this product, or tell me how you did making this product. And so there's a huge tie. And so the takeaway from here is that we need to look at these systems together, and one really can't live without the other. Here's kind of a loaded question. What are some of the best OT practices that you've seen? And really, have you seen those adopted from 62443 practices? So I'm kind of combining two questions. Joe?
Well, some of the things that the most important ones that I've seen are to take the basic concepts and then extend them. For example, segmentation is one of the most important things that you can do. You want to segment, first off, the IT world from the OT world. That's a level 3.5 in the model. Okay, that firewall which says only authorized communication can pass between these environments, and that's it. But the best practice is then to segment even further between plants, between production lines within a plant, even to the point of micro-segmenting, so that no device can actually talk to another device without going through a firewall. Now, the reason that's important is not because of the devices themselves. It's because if an attacker gets into one of them, one of the things that they are going to do is what's called living off the land. They're going to use tools that they've got to try to get access to other devices within the environment. So that's that segmentation and micro segmentation are really important. Now, I've been seeing the IT OT segmentation that happens a lot.
Sure.
Sub-segmentations really depends on the organization. I know a few that are down to the micro segmentation level, but that's really something that is leading edge right now to be doing that. And you need specific types of equipment, specific types of firewalls that can deal with that, with the different industrial protocols that will be going on for protection. So that would be one area that I would say is a real best case. In fact, an example that I can use is I was working with a steel manufacturer, and they had different levels of security for different parts of the environment, but they had multiple depths of segmentation around the furnaces, because you're dealing with 3,000 degrees Celsius and molten steel. And that area, this gets back to the vulnerability versus risk. They realized that was very vulnerable, and they wanted to reduce the risk as much as possible.
Mm-hmm. Jay, what have you seen as best practices, and were they related somehow to 62443?
Yeah, so I think I'm going to take a different stab a little bit at what Joe has mentioned, which I agree with. So some very relevant points there again. So I think that one of the cornerstones that I've seen, so first of all, not enough IEC 62443 adoption, unfortunately. So I need to call that out, because what I'm seeing in the field is mostly pockets of competence. So even within certain organizations, you'll have one factory or one plant or a specific team working for a facility or a group of facilities, whether it's a region or a business process. I've made some strides towards investing in IEC or self-assessing or getting themselves the capabilities to be able to measure their progress, or at least get a stake in the ground as to where they stand today. So, but I see that there's a greater amount of investment and a visibility into their people and their skill set. So I think that's one of the most fundamental things. And in order to have a standard like this live, it needs to be sustained and it needs to become systemic across organizations. And I think that's where I've seen recent progress in a number of different companies that we do business with or that we consult with, is the recognition that in order to be able to assess yourself, you need to have the proper methodology, the proper standards as it applies to your organization, and choose the right one, and then invest in your capabilities to be able to evolve from there and have a good understanding of where you need to start, because every organization is going to be different. Your risk profile or threat profile is going to be different. If you're a steel manufacturer, especially these days, you're going to have some greater concerns than you did in the past. Potentially, energy is always a popular target. You need to deal with your risk profile in a way that needs to live out in terms of the investments that you make. But in terms of best practice, I agree with Joe's terms. I think that one of the things that I've seen very recently in a large oil and gas producer is the systemic understanding that they can't do it by themselves and they can't do it alone. Therefore, they need to find the right trusted advisors to get them on that path. And they had a very thorough process to make sure that they were partnered with the right service providers, as well as understanding how the standard was going to apply to them and what they needed to prioritize in terms of next steps. So assess often as you can, recognizing that if you have a large footprint, you need to leverage the right teams and efforts to be able to get that first glance, that first understanding of where you stand, and that'll inform you on prioritization and planning and so on in the future.
Yeah, I wish I had a lot of time to kind of weed through all this. The only thing I'll add, and then we're going to go to the question and answers from the audience and get their participation. But I think there are steps and basic awarenesses of the 62443, and that it is detailed. So there's high level standards, and then eventually they get to the meat on the bones, so to speak. And 62443 has some meat on the bones. And it was a wide set of documents, and they are bite-sized chunks that you can do. And doing nothing is really, these days, especially with the world the way it's turning out, is not much of an option. And especially 62443 kind of gives us a guiding light, some checklist of things to think about, and I really like it. And I've seen, like you say, adoption equals 0 to adoption equal, oh my goodness, they're on like a maturity model, which is really, really good. So with that said, I'd like to flip this over to the question and answer session, and I'll ask Carol, I believe, who has maybe queued up some questions for us, and we'll all three take a shot at answering them. So Carol, I believe it might be you.
Yeah, thanks so much. Yes, we do have some questions ready for the Q&A. However, if anyone has any questions for our presenters, please enter it into the Q&A window now. This first one asks, it says, hi, Jeffrey, it's interesting to see how you are mapping SRs with security controls and vendors. To get access to this sheet, in the field, I saw different vendors and consultant interpret these SRs differently.
Yeah, so again, I think because it doesn't specifically tell you how to do it, it tells you what the requirements are. That was my interpretation for my own Rockwell days, so to speak. And what we did was we took everything out of those foundational requirements and the extensions to that and said, golly, what products do we have? And how do they embrace these different, I'll call them technical controls because I don't know a better word. So there was that side, and then there was going out in the field and seeing across the fruited plain, by golly, they have all of these different system components, and this doesn't have any authorization. So we can't do security level even 1 on this thing. And so it was blending some kind of understanding with the devices that we had, all the way through the systems that we had, and coming up with kind of our best answer. We think this is a security level 2 as it stands, but if we want to get to 4, we're going to have to do these particular things. So hopefully I answered that question. And thank you for the question, by the way.
All right, thank you. This one says, which would be the first most important steps an organization would need to take in an OT cybersecurity program? Identity, network, patching, vulnerability management, etc. And then they added also looking for some budget, limited resources organization versus timeline from a risk perspective. Thanks.
Guys, want to take a crack at it? And I'll follow up.
That's a loaded question. So first, I think that you need to be aware of what organization, vertical business that you're in, because your risk profile is going to be different than your neighbors. I think there's an understanding of your own business that needs to be part of this conversation, but also where you're starting from. So is the board supportive? Have you had supply chain events around your organizations? Have you had an event yourself? There are a number of things that are going to impact where you need to begin. If I had none of that information and I had to answer this in the blank, I would say, why compromise? So when you're looking at what you have, an understanding of what your environment is, it is a collection of things. It's a collection of your assets, their profiles. It's a collection of the IT infrastructure that you've put in place, the network connectivity, the permissions, the controls that you have existing. Are you able to gather all this information as part of a technical assessment? Yes, you are. So there's no specific thing that you need to parse out in terms of getting good initial visibility within your environment. The tools are available now that you can get a proper 360-degree understanding of what your current environment is. And I think that the question is going to become, where do you start from a level perspective? Do you start with a specific system or machine? Do you start with a production line? Do you start with an entire site and graduate yourself as you go through time? But you have to start somewhere. And I would think that I would try to identify which are more vulnerable sites, or which part of my organization I believe is more at risk, and start there.
Yeah, it's the old what part of the how do you eat an elephant? Well, one bite at a time, and you've got to take the pieces as they are. There's the old, this is a variation on the other question that I get, which is I need to put in cybersecurity for OT. Where should I start? What's the most important thing to start with? And as Jay, you said, it depends on your situation. Getting visibility, understanding what you've got is really important. In some cases, you may need to start with segmentation, at least divide the IT and the OT. It may be you really need to look at the access and authorization levels. I was dealing with one company that has ships that do undersea exploration. And they're basically floating factories, and they had the IT and the OT. They were all together. So we helped them separate those. But then they had manufacturers of their equipment, and you'll see this anywhere, that wanted to get in for remote maintenance. And for remote maintenance, you want to be able to put in place some kind of an authorization, what we would call a zero trust, so that those devices and those assets that don't have any security, you can say, the manufacturer's maintenance person can have access to only the part of the network that has that particular asset on it. And that might be one of the places to start. There are so many different ways to start. You really need to step back and say, where is it most critical, and which piece of the elephant am I going to start with?
Yeah, I wouldn't add a whole lot to that. You have to know what you have. You have to know where you're going. And basically that starts with, asset identification, knowing what's kind of baseline, knowing what's supposed to be talking to what, and then securing it from that. But executive charter it won't go anywhere without executive charter. So
yeah, and to Joe's point, make sure it's an elephant. Maybe it's a hippo or a rhino. You need to understand what your environment is before you start making decisions. So 9 times out of 10 with the end users that I interact with, they don't have a good understanding or good awareness of what their environment actually compromises. And you know, the number one sin, unfortunately, that we see in OT is that IT has way too much access into the OT environment. And it's not through ill intent. It's over, you know, years and years of decision making and providing better KPIs and business metrics and access to this system and that system, or service maintenance or service providers. You have to take a step back and understanding how you've made your environment porous to a certain extent and what controls you need to put in place and monitor yourself. It's, you know, security and compliance are not destinations, they're journeys. They need to be sustained, they need to be fed, they need to live, which is one of the things I like about IEC is that it's an open standard, it's a living standard. It continuously evolves and provides you the tools. And there was a question before in regards, you know, the interpretation of the standard. My recommendation is always go back to the source, go back to the fundamental meaning of the security controls or the security standards that are set in the documentation and interpretate from there. Be careful of the marketing and be careful of the interpretations that others are making, because it suits often their own journey in helping you move forward. And certainly it can be very helpful, but getting that understanding of how it impacts you and your organization and the vertical that you in, as well as the, you know, baggage, experience, and assets that your organization has that is going to be always different than the company next door or the one down the road. Yes. That's the challenge in OT.
So I think we're going to probably wrap this up. Unfortunately, we've ran out of time. So just as a recap, again, we've been saying this, that IEC 62443 is an evolving standard. It gives us a common vocabulary, gives us a great checklist for areas of focus. It gives us the ability to find security levels that we kind of all understand. There are about 7 things that you should consider when you're thinking about securing an ICS system. And of course, there are overlaps, great overlaps with IT systems, but IEC was created to specifically address in very major detail what is the differences between an OT system and an IT system, and what are the considerations for it. With that, SANS Institute, we would like to thank you for attending this webcast. From myself, Jeff Shear, Joe Robertson, and Jay, we appreciate you helping us with this webcast. And to our audience, I just want to say thank you for spending your time with us. And with that, I'll pass it over to Carol.
All right. Thank you so much, Jay, Joe, and Jeff, for your great presentation, and to Fortinet and Notorio for sponsoring this webcast, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.
Thank you.